what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of come down from Ben's very broad conceptual discussion of pyrosilviculture. I'm going to talk about a specific case study that I've been part of right here in southern Indiana that are kind of applying some of these techniques that he talked about. So before I say anything else, though, I just kind of like to mention that the project I'm going to talk about has been long-term, and it's had a lot of collaborators. I'm not sure why it's not advancing. Oh, okay. Pause for a second. That's the problem. I'm facing you, so I'm not actually watching my screen. There it is. Okay, so this study has been long-term, and it's had a lot of collaborators. And I first became involved in this study not long after I started at Purdue. And I'm speaking from personal experience here, but there is probably no creature more desperate and feral than a brand new assistant professor at a Research One university trying to figure out what they're going to do for a living. And I felt very fortunate when Dan Day and Chris Thornton from the Forest Service approached me and asked me if I wanted to collaborate as part of this long-term study they were putting in the ground to look at the effects of silviculture and fire on forest regeneration and herbaceous layer response. I was very appreciative of that, and I was also very appreciative when they told me there was going to be money available to help fund graduate students to work on that project. You know, for a new assistant professor, that's exactly the kind of thing they want to hear. So on the subject of grad students as well, I also want to mention the first name up there, Sarah Rademacher. That's her in the top left picture on the left there. And she was a grad student who came in to work on this project that I advised. And during my talk, I'm going to be using what's called the academic we. Y'all have probably heard the royal we. You know, we do not approve. We wish to welcome you to Buckingham Palace. The academic we means I'm going to say things like, we sample 30 plots per sample unit or per treatment unit, or we use mixed effects models to analyze our data. What I really mean is Sarah and her technicians sampled those 30 plots per sample unit. And I went out for a few days when the weather was nice and kind of hung around and tried to help a little bit. Or that Sarah kind of spent those hours and hours, tied to her computer trying to figure out how to make her R code run. So you'll be hearing we, but when you hear we, in your head, insert Sarah, okay? Because this is the academic we, and she actually did all of the really important work on this project. And if anybody's interested in seeing the paper that came from this first part of Sarah's research project, it came out last year in Forest Science. So project I'm going to talk about is affectionately referred to by the list of collaborators as the Oriole Project. And that's because the location of the project is down around the Oriole Trail part of the Hoosier National Forest. But the project was started in 2010 by the Forest Service, and it wanted to examine the effects of overstory, midstory, and fire treatments and how these affected forest regeneration and the herb layer. And originally it was designed to have two complementary parts, consisting of two different study sites. There was Jeffries, which was, both of these are white oak dominated sites, but Jeffries is kind of on the low end of productivity for a white oak site in southern Indiana. And the other one was 66, which is kind of on the high end of productivity for a white oak site in Indiana. So the goal was to expose these two sites to the same series of treatments and see how their responses deviated based upon the differences in site quality. Unfortunately, this paired study, at least initially, fell apart a little bit when the Forest Service had trouble being able to put a burn into the 66 site. So today I'm just going to be talking about the Jeffrey site, which was the lower end of that productivity scale. Kind of as a side note though, since Sarah has finished her degree, the Forest Service was able to do a prescribed burn at the 66 site. And I currently have a grad student who's going to be analyzing that data as part of his thesis. So hopefully we're going to be able to kind of restore that kind of paired study and look at how these responses differ based upon the inherent productivity of those sites. So this study consisted of originally of two different harvest treatments. We had a shelter wood and a commercial thinning. But after initial analysis, we found that the residual basal area that remained after those two treatments did not differ. They were pretty much identical. So we then combine that thinning and that silvicultural treatment into a single grouping of overstory treatments, which is referred to as being a shelter wood from here on out. And they also did a mid-story treatment where trees greater than an inch were cut to kind of open up the understory. And then we had a fire as well. So the fire occurred during the spring of 2019, about 5 years after the silvicultural treatments were completed, and involved an aerial and hand ignitions. So the area burned as part of this burn was actually much larger than our study area, and our study area was a portion within that larger burn. And I'm not going to get too much into these kind of summary numbers, but this is just looking at fire conditions and fire behavior and intensity and severity. And just from these numbers, you can note that this fire kind of fits in with kind of a moderate intensity burn within this part of the world. So it's kind of a pretty typical prescribed burn like you'd expect to see in a forest like this. So the overall objective of this study, especially after we kind of started focusing purely on the Jeffries portion of the study, was to look at how we could use these silvicultural treatments in fire to hopefully push this low productivity in the site in a direction that we could ensure oak regeneration and ensure that oak was going to become a major component in that next developing forest after harvest. The two questions we're kind of looking at as part of this was, first of all, what effect did the mid-story treatments have? Is that something that helps facilitate this establishment of oak? And then also, as a combination of the single burn along with these silvicultural treatments, allow us to get oak established on this low productivity site without the need for the repeated burning that Ben talked about that occurred in some of the early Brose work, where you have this repeated burning to establish oak regeneration, and then you have that fire-free period. The question we're asking in this study is if maybe you can skip that repeated burning, have a reduced number of burns, even a single burn, and then allow oak to establish and at least start to kind of ascend to the canopy. Let's go look at our study sites. We collected multiple years of pre-burn data, and these were typically centered around including measurements before and after the overstory treatments and also the mid-story treatments. We collected post-burn data after 2019 burn in 2021, and we collected data on multiple aspects of the study site. We looked at slope and aspect. After the burn, we collected char heights for severity, and we also had temperature measurements from paint tags and from hobo units to look at temperature. We collected data on fuels, and we also collected soil samples from each plot to allow us to look at how soil productivity at a local scale might influence what happens on those individual plots. And on the left up here, you have our plot design. It had a typical nested plot design where we looked at overstory and the subcanopy and midstory in those two concentric plots. But that little circle in the upper right quadrant there, that's where we actually were looking at regeneration. And within that circle, we looked at regeneration kind of the classical sense where you go out there and you just count stems of all the different species. And here we're defining regeneration as all woody stems that are 1.5 inches or less in diameter. But what was also really, I think, novel about this study, and also pretty aggravating for the people who were doing the study, was before any of the harvests were put in, before the fire happened, within that general area, that circular plot, seedlings or regeneration was selected, and they were marked with the pigtail, and we tracked those, we tracked those individual seedlings through time. So after they got ran over by the equipment going through for the harvest, we tracked them. After the mid-story removal, we tracked them, and after the fire, we tracked them. So it was kind of doing like kind of a, kind of like forensic or post-mortem forestry, but it really allowed us to start looking at what's happening with some of those regeneration stems when you kind of move forward with this kind of repeated treatment study. So I'm not going to go too much into the models here because, like I mentioned, this was a lot of what Sarah spent an awful lot of time on. But we looked at response variables that were related to survival, resprouting, and density of regeneration. And then Sarah used multiple models to kind of fit different aspects of that data based on the characteristics of that data. But with regard to survival, we're looking at the likelihood of survival. With our sprouting, we're looking at the likelihood of sprouting. the number of sprouts and the height of the sprouts, and then also looking at the overall density by species of regeneration. So we also looked at several explanatory variables to see how they really related back to those response variables. These included elements of forest structure like basal area and density. We also looked at measurements of fire severity, intensity, char height, and fire temperature. I also previously mentioned we looked at soil chemistry, we looked at landscape or topographic characteristics, fuel characteristics, and also the response based upon individual tree, on the species that the individual tree was, and also the height class of individual stems. And all of these were looked to see how these factors influence those response variables related to survival, resprouting, and density. So because you put so much work into it, I'm going to go through Sarah's results, but a lot of times you can kind of show an effect best with just a picture. So on the right up here is from Jeffries, and this is where we, within our unit, where we had burning but no harvest treatments and no mid-story treatments. And you know, from this kind of dark photograph, it's hard to tell after a couple of years a burn even happened there. On the left is also within Jeffries, and that's where we've had all of the silvicultural treatments followed by the fire. In the foreground, you notice a prodigious amount of white oak. And obviously, we put one of our best pictures up here to show the best side of our study. But this was kind of the best case scenario within our forest study area, but it wasn't an unusual scenario. This was repeated throughout that unit. So this was something that was pretty typical across the burn unit, this very strong response of oaks. You'll also notice it's much more open. And if you look, you know, especially behind that big wall of white oak, we also had a lot of graminoids and a lot greater herbaceous species diversity. I'm going to kind of get to that at the end if I have time. But going through some of Sarah's results, this first figure shows seedling survival, and that first table on the left shows post-burn, so looking at survival before and after the burn. And the second table shows survival looking across the entire study period, so starting with the overstory treatments, ending with the fire. And the green box shows all of our oak species, and then the red, of course, shows our dominant mesophytic species, the maple. And the first thing you'll notice for both the entire study and the pre and post burn is we're getting just much, much greater survival with our oak species. So we're seeing much, much greater survival of oak species. And this is based upon those individual tag seedlings where we're tracking the fate of individual stems. So oak is persisting much better. And if we look at how the survival changes through time, you'll see where the burn is. To the left half of that figure, or about the left 2/3 of that figure, represents all of the silvicultural treatments and mid-story treatments. And you see white oak here as an example is that green line. White oak is kind of holding its own with most of the species. But after the burn, you'll notice that kind of shifts itself out again. And now white oak is having much greater survivorship than all the other species. So kind of holding its own with the silvicultural treatments, and then kind of starting to kind of move and have higher survivorship following the fire. If we look at the rate of resprouting, here again, especially compared to maple, we see oak is showing a much, much greater rate of resprouting. So more of our individual tract seedlings are resprouting after the fire compared to maple. But if we look at the number of sprouts, so each individual top killed regeneration stem, we're tracking how many sprouts did that individual stem produce, we really don't see much difference. So even though what we saw is with the oak species, we're getting more of them actually sprouting, but we're getting generally the same number of sprouts regardless of species. And if you look at resprout height, you'll notice across all of our stems post-burn, pre and post-burn on the left, you'll notice that we're really not seeing much difference in height across our species. Oak did not significantly differ from any other species. Any of our oak species not different from other species with regard to resprout height. But if you look on the right, looking through time, you'll notice that oak, again, white oak in this example, the green line is kind of keeping its own with the other species. And that top line you see on the left is ironwood. And ironwood was really doing a pretty good job of overtopping and really growing a lot taller than the other species. And after the fire, everything's kind of evened out. And in that short interval after the fire, we see that oak is even more kind of fitting in and kind of holding its own with the other species. This is probably our most striking finding. This is looking at just overall simple number of stems, not ones necessarily we're tracking through time, but just total number of stems post-fire. And before and after the fire, we had a more than doubling of the number of white oak regeneration we had on our site. And this was a much greater rate of increase than white ash and also greater than ironwood. So of all of our species, white oak showed the greatest regeneration response after the fire. And we also noticed that, the height really didn't differ much across our species. So this is different height classes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. As you go up in number, you're getting a bigger and bigger individual. And you'll notice that with regard to height, oak is pretty much the same height as all the other stems across all the size classes. So no real height generation, but oak's not being overtopped yet either. And if we look at the relationship to some of our explanatory variables, this is looking at char height. Char height was associated with reduced survival odds, reduced resprouting, reduced number of resprouts, and reduced number of overall seedlings. However, this is for all species combined, looking at all seedlings. If we look at the association with individual species, we actually found that greater char height or greater burn severity was associated with greater density of oak species and a lower density of mesophytic species. So here again, even though you're getting this negative effect overall, it's favoring oak. Now, we also noted that greater pH was associated with reduced survival odds and reduced resprouting and number of resprouts. But this was largely happening with competitors of oak, and this is largely because those microsites with the better site quality, better soil quality, likely had more of those other species. We also noticed that not unexpectedly, survival and resprouting was associated with higher levels of fuel, and where you had more shading, you had less resprout height because of competition for light. One thing we also found with our mid-story treatments is we had pretty mixed effects. And we actually had greater survival in taller seedlings where we did not have mid-story removal. And we had higher seedling densities without removal than we did with our chemical removal. So this kind of led us to believe that, in this very, very low productivity site, mid-story removal may be counterproductive on these xeric sites. So conclusions from the study were greater survival and resprouting of oak compared to competing species across our sites. White oak in particular did very well and doubled in density and was one of the most abundant species. White oak seedlings were competitive with other species, but we're looking at a relatively short post-burn period, and more monitoring is needed to see how this trend continues. And at least initially, our study suggested a single burn following harvest on low productivity sites may be sufficient to promote oak species on these sites and create a large enough oak component to carry forward in the developing stand. And just the last couple of slides, I want to mention kind of an epilogue, because I think I included this in the abstract about what we were seeing with in the herbaceous layer for Sarah's study. And not unexpectedly, if you look across the entire sequence of our study, starting with the harvest treatments and ending with the burning, we saw an increase in richness, evenness, diversity, and total cover in the herbaceous layer. This is an ordination analysis that just shows how composition shifted through time. And it was pretty striking going from 2011 to 2020, this uniform compositional change across all of our plots, and this movement towards greater dominance of grasses, sedges, herbs, and rubus. So what we saw here was that our treatments did kind of create this more open, more species-rich understory. But interesting enough, you look at what was correlated with that shift along axis 1, we didn't find any of our measures of fire severity or intensity were related to that axis. And what we think might be happening here is either A, the fire, regardless of severity, was enough to shift all these sites. So it didn't really matter exactly how severe that burn was on a site. Or it might have been that a lot of this effect came into being because of the effects of the silvicultural treatments that kind of did that major shifting, and the fire was kind of a last part of that. Or the fact that there's some other variable explaining this shift that we didn't measure in our study. But overall, this is pretty positive results that not only did their study treatments produce desired oak regeneration, but also seem to be moving the structure and herbaceous composition of this forest in a way that a lot of our talks today have shown is kind of desirable in these dry forests. So just a few quick acknowledgments, and if I have time, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.